Yeah. So I wanted to talk about this today because there's all these different changes are happening, and people need to have some kind of background or some kind of understanding about that, I think. So oftentimes, when I see couples in my practice, it's because there's what they call in my business a life cycle issue or life family issue. That is, the kids have gone off to college, or they have a new baby, or somebody's retired, or somebody's gotten sick. So these are the times when people tend to be stressed, people tend to be anxious, and people tend to be going through these complicated internal changes. Like, I think most of us are feeling more vulnerable than we have in the past. So besides the anxiety and the confusion, the lack of energy for some of you, there's that feeling of vulnerability. I was walking in my neighborhood where I see some of my neighbors now, people I've known off and on, for a long time now, some of whom I talk to and some of them I don't. But I got into this conversation with one of my neighbors, a woman's about 45. She's a school teacher with a couple kids. And when I was talking to her, we were just talking about shopping, but I just felt my heart was so open to her. And I realized that, like, there's a kind of a vulnerability that comes with these times. And so that vulnerability is part of what happens in these life cycle changes, that we start feeling open, we start feeling anxious, we start wondering a little bit about our identity. And so all that is happening now, and it's compounded by the fears of illness and the fears that our loved ones will be sick, or will be sick. So, and the news is just so intense. So besides the internal things that are happening, we're being bombarded by all this information. And so one of the things reasons I wanted to give a little talk like this was to just outline some of the predictable things that can happen, and then say to yourself, well, how can we bring mindfulness? How can we bring consciousness to bear at a time like this? So very briefly, the vulnerability, anxiety, tend to overstimulate our nervous systems, and then we tend to be more reactive to each other. We tend to go into what I lovingly call the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the relationship apocalypse. I didn't come up with that term, but I have my own four particular horsemen. That is pursuing and withdrawing, and defending and attacking. Those are the four horsemen. That's 8. There's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I'll come back to those. But those are all forms of overstimulation, okay? Because the patterns tend to replicate. An attacker tends to need a withdrawer. As the attacker attacks more, the defender, attacker attacks, the defender pushes back against that. So in those patterns, what you find is a kind of overstimulation, and the patterns tend to increase in intensity. So in this vulnerable time, in this anxious time, you can expect patterns like that to continue that stimulation more and more. And that's why some of you are feeling a kind of emotional exhaustion, or a tendency to distance, just to take a deep breath. There's so much like people living together now. So Deborah and I like to say that now that I've attained this age, I'm an expert at all 4 of these defenses or strategies. Attacking, defending, I'm great at both. And pursuing and withdrawing, I'm great at both. So I'm going to show you briefly how this works in a conversation which I'm sure none of you have had in the last 3 weeks. One of you says, "You didn't wash your hands." And the other one says, "I did too. You didn't wash them for 40 seconds. I washed them for 32 seconds, and that's plenty. I had soap on my hands." "No, you didn't. We're all going to die because of you." Attack, defend. I know that Deborah and I are the only people that have had that conversation in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That's just a very simple example, but the topics that are arising now for us to have these patterns on are so intense, and that's because of the anxiety, the chaos, and the threat. So what's important about the patterns is, I think most of you can identify that we have them, because what happens when the patterns arise is that they tend to intersect with each other. and they can intersect with each other. The same patterns, most of you that have been studying yourself understand that these patterns can replicate dozens of times, hundreds of times in a long marriage. And they tend to replicate more intensely in these stressed situations. So there's a lot that could be said about that in terms of psychological orientation and your origins and child of family of origin stuff. But we're just going to have a little time today to talk about that. Carl Jung said famously, unconscious tends to create or evoke unconsciousness. That means that an attacking, angry, blaming type will attract a defense of some kind. So the important news here as we get started is that consciousness and mindfulness can change these patterns. I think each one of you joined the class because you have some vision that even though times are tense, you still want to be a loving person. You want to be a conscious person. You want to be a generous person, a forgiving person. And generally speaking, that's what I call the path for couples. That's, of course, the name of my book and my website, A Path for Couples. Many of you sense that you're on a path. And now is a particularly challenging time to be on that path because those of us that are applying consciousness to our patterns innately become more vulnerable. So we're like vulnerable on top of vulnerable. And the most important thing that can happen at this time, and it's an opportunity for all of us to bring more consciousness to our relationships. If there was ever a time when this world or this country or this state or this county or this neighborhood or this home needed more compassion, more generosity, more acceptance, more forgiveness, more ease, more creativity, it's now. And all of those benefits are going to come through mindfulness, through consciousness, through watching your reactive pattern, watching the four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. That's the attacking, defending, pursuing, withdrawing, and being able to become more conscious of that. So that's the point of this talk now, is to help you see that this is the time for those of you that are working on these skills to apply them as well as you can. And that's what this talk is about, so that you can have some inspiration to do that. So I'm going to leave the talk there and go on to working with some of the couples here.